Okay, so we're recording. I'm going to go ahead and open this up. Yes.
So, with this project, I want to make sure I have my system all correct. Do the legs actually need to be attached to the main body, or can they be individual objects?
They can be individual objects. So that's a great question. Thanks for starting out with that. I'll just show you how mine is set up. Mine is actually a whole bunch of individual pieces over here, right? Shift H. So it doesn't have to be attached, like this doesn't have to be one mesh. And I just started realizing the other day, because I had a lot of students who would do that, who would like combine everything together. And you can do that. The thing about that is we're going to kind of combine this together in a different way, right? So it's not a necessary part of this. The way mine is set up is literally a whole bunch of different objects here. And so, actually, can you all see this? Do I need to turn off the lights, turn down the lights? What? Let's see. Is that better, or is that just going to put you all to sleep? Better. It's better. Okay, cool. I should mention also, I'm broadcasting through the WebEx thing if you want to load that up so you can watch it on your screen as well. And I'm recording right now. So the way I have this set up is like each of these pieces is a separate object over here. Like that's the skirt, that's the body, the bow. All these different things are different pieces, right? Or different meshes. If you combine them together, it will still work, but it makes other elements of this a little more complicated, such as like if you select that mesh to do some texture work, it's all going to share that same texture map, so you would have to apply texture maps to certain faces instead. So it's a little clunky to work that way. I usually leave it separate. Depending on the output of this, different people will advise you differently. For a while, video game engines really wanted it all to be one mesh, and that was so it had fewer draw calls for that mesh. Now it's not really as much of an issue. So this is what I have. Wanted to show you a couple of elements of this. Again, all of this broken up into pieces, and although this is not exciting, they are all named. I would strongly encourage you to today think a lot about your naming convention, because this is going to get complicated. Like the way we rig this is going to get kind of convoluted. And if your model is P-Sphere 75, P-Sphere 76, you need to know what that is. So just take a little bit of time before we jump too deep into this and name these individual pieces so you know what they are. Right now, you'll actually see like I have two left eyes. I have left eye and left eye one. I'll just go ahead and rename that. That's where I duplicated one. I'll go ahead and call that right eye, RI. So a couple of things you're going to do before we get started, right? We're going to animate this with a special kind of deformer. So you remember what's another deformer we've used in the past?
Nonlinear.
Yeah, the nonlinear deformers, like the squash and stretch, stuff like that, right? So a deformer is just something that changes our model at the vertex level, right? So we know that I can grab the object, I can rotate it, I can scale it, I can do all that. But like the nonlinear deformers, like the squash and stretch, made it bulge in the center or get skinnier in the center, right? And so it's like a different way of calculating how we're going to do that. So we're going to use a special kind of deformer called a joint, as in like a hinge joint, right? Like your elbow is a joint, right? Some programs actually call it a skeleton. Well, Maya calls it a skeleton too. But some of them will call it bones, like in 3D Studio Max, the deformer is called a bone. And so we're going to use that to pretty much build an artificial skeleton for our character and use that to manipulate it, right? I'll get into that in just a minute, but before we get into all of that, we need to prep this, because there are certain things that after we add that deformer to the model will cause problems, right? So here's what I always do before I rig. First, you want to make sure that any UV unwrapping you need to do, you've done, right? If you haven't yet, that's okay. You can still start the skeleton creation spot part of this, but before we skin it, you need to get the UVs done. The reason for that is like an input order. It's like an order of command. So like we're going to distort all of these vertices, right? But when we set up our UVs, that's also like sort of aligning all of those vertices to a 2D image. And so we have to do it in that order, or what will happen is it will line them up to a 2D image after it distorted it. And so like your texture will like crawl all over the object. It's really weird. So to prevent that, it's just a good idea. I mean, it's not unfixable if that happens. Like we can always fix it. It's just a little extra work. So usually, just for cleanliness reasons, do like whatever necessary UV work you need to do before we rig it. The other thing I do is I always make sure that all of my objects, I've deleted my history on them and I've frozen my transformations. Unfortunately, I've already kind of done that on these objects, but let me show you anyway. I just grab everything, including the floor, if you want to. Do edit, delete by type, history. And what that does is that gets rid of all of those little modeling commands that you did to create this, like the extrude. Every time you do that, it adds some history to the object. It clears all that out, and Maya thinks of it as a new object. So edit, delete by type, history, and then modify, freeze transformations. I know we've talked about this before, but what this does is it resets all your translates, rotates, and scales back to the default numbers, which is 0 and 1, right? 0 for translate and rotate, and 1 for scale. So I'm going to do both of those things. I'm going to make sure my UVs are clean. And now we're actually ready to start rigging this thing. So before we do that, before I actually just jump in and start throwing joints into this, let's talk a little bit about how those work. Right? So I'm actually going to open another version of Maya, and we'll just sort of play in there for a second.
What do you do when it won't freeze transformations? Because it's like got a translate X as an incoming connection.
So yeah, so the incoming connection is actually a keyframe. You see it down there? So right-click on that and delete the keyframe. There you go. So that was a good question. He had tried to delete or freeze his transformations, and it said it couldn't because it had an incoming connection. What that incoming connection was is you probably accidentally had hit S, and so there was a keyframe on that, right? And so what we had told Maya to do when we said freeze our transformations, we said set all that back to 0 and 1, and Maya was like, but you told me to always have it at this number on this time when you set a keyframe, right? So it's like two conflicting commands. If you accidentally set any keyframes on it, just go ahead and delete those, and that should work. So, all right. So I'm going to make a couple of objects here. I'm going to make a couple of cylinders. And from all exterior purposes, they're going to look exactly the same. So I'll go ahead and move this one over. The only difference is on this one, I'm going to add a whole bunch of height subdivisions. Right? So those two models look the same, right? When I highlight them, we can see the difference. We can see that P-cylinder 1 has a whole bunch of spans in the middle of it, right? P-cylinder 2, though, is just made up of one polygon tall. It's a really long, stretched out polygon, but it's one polygon tall, right? And so you can see that if I right-click on here and go to face, right, it's that one giant face there, right, is the entire length of it. Versus if I select this face, it's that one little bitty one, right? So I bring that up because you can't bend a polygon. You can't bend a face or an edge, right? Those are always going to be perfectly straight. So when we start modeling this or when we start rigging this, the one thing we need to remember is that we need enough edges in there. We need enough edge loops in there that when we deform this, it will actually like retain its shape. So I will show you what I'm talking about right now with one of the deformers we're already familiar with, which is the bend deformer, right? If I select this object, I'm going to go ahead and go to animation. It's also under rigging. This deform, and I'll do a nonlinear bend on here. Right? Well, the one with a whole bunch of spans, we can get a really nice curve on it, right? If we do that on this one, bend, right, we can still do this curve, but it's going to do something different, right? And the reason is it can't bend that single polygon, right? It can't bend that single face. And so we have to keep that in mind because we're going to put another deformer on our character. And if there's certain areas you need this character to bend, like their legs, that needs to have additional edge loops in there so it will actually bend, right? So that is something to remember. I'm going to go ahead and delete these two bend tools and just kind of show you how this works now. I'll leave this one here and sort of scoot it over. We may come back to that, but we're mainly going to focus on this guy.
What if your curvatures doesn't go past -2 or +3?
In the curvature?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
You were in the 80s on yours.
Is it right here?
Yeah.
I don't know. I can look at it for you. -2 or +3.
Yeah, that's the range it goes to. It's weird.
Try just typing a higher number in there.
Okay.
That's interesting though. So those deformers are still valid. Oops, sorry. Did that work?
Yeah.
That's weird. So those deformers will still work, but it's a little confusing on exactly how we would rig an entire character with that bend deformer, right? Like, would you have to kind of like bend the legs and like have them kick underneath the character? Like that's not very intuitive, right? And so we're going to use a different kind of deformer. And if we're in the rigging menu, which I currently am, all right, so this little drop down going to rigging, you'll see a couple of the things we're going to use here, skeleton and skin. You see these two? So let's start with the skeleton menu. If I open this up, you'll see this create joints option there. So I'm just going to go ahead and create some joints. I'll go create, and I'll just kind of do it on the floor here. Just start clicking stuff. Right. And you'll see that they just look a little different, right? They are kind of like a sphere with a pyramid that connects the two, right? And if I hit render, even if there's lights in these scenes, those objects aren't going to show up. These are not renderable objects. We can see them in the viewport, but they don't render, right? So the other thing that I want you to recognize is that they're all connected, right? Even though I was creating new objects, if I go to rotate here and I select this one and I start rotating it, all the ones above it are connected, right? And if we look at our menu here, you'll see that that's just because each of those joints are parented underneath each other, right? So really all a joint is a hierarchy of these invisible points, right? That we can put in a parent-child relationship and sort of rotate them like a chain, right? If I grab all of them at once, like I have right now, and I rotate them, let's try a different axis here. We can see it. I guess that's why. Right, they're all going to kind of rotate together, right? And so you can see that this is very akin to how our actual body works, right? And that like annoying song, the shin bone's connected to the whatever bone, like that whole thing, right? but that is how my arm works, right? Like I rotate my clavicle up, I rotate my shoulder, I rotate my elbow, I rotate my hand, and that's how I get in this configuration, right? This very comfortable looking configuration. This is, and that's a hierarchy as well. It's a parent-child relationship. So that's all this really is doing, is creating these like little nodes that are in a hierarchy. But those nodes are also deformers, okay? Right now, they're not deforming anything. We have to skin them to an object before they do. Right? So I'm going to go to like my front view here so I can kind of see this from this angle. All right. Go ahead and hit 4 so we can see this. And I'm going to go to Skeleton, Create Joints. And I'm just going to go ahead and, if I hold down X, I can snap to my grid. See that? So I'm going to go ahead and just start clicking on the grid here. If you hold down Shift, it will draw them in a straight line. Right? And so I'm just making this chain of joints that go through my cylinder. So if you look in here, like it's inside that cylinder, right? And just like that previous chain of joints, if I selected all of them and hit and rotated, right, they're all going to kind of rotate together. Or if I just grab a single one and rotate it, I can sort of pose this entire thing in a different shape, right? So there's still just a series of joints. Where this actually becomes useful is when I turn it into a deformer. So if I grab that chain of joints, so I hit, select it, hold Shift, I'm going to select the mesh I want it to deform. So I have to select both of those and go to Skin. Basically now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it, if these are joints, if these are bones, right, what is the thing that those bones are driving? What is the skin, right? And so I'm going to pick this first option here, bind skin. Okay. Now there's some options on that. We may look at those a little bit later. Right now I'm just going to click bind skin and use the default options. And it doesn't look like much happened except for those joints changed colors. That's really just so you can kind of see which one's which. And you can see I can still grab it, right? But if I rotate that joint now, it's going to deform my object, right? So I can start grabbing these joints and posing my object however I want to. Right? Each of these joints are also keyframeable, right? So I can grab all of those and hit S and go out to frame 20. Go ahead and zero out all my rotations to get it straight again. And so now you see that I can get this very precise control, right? So if you think about it, that makes sense, right? Maya, like you've modeled a robot, but Maya doesn't know the difference between a leg and a coffee cup and a spoon and a cereal box, right? Maya just knows faces and points and stuff like that. It has no worldly context to those objects, right? So what we're doing with these joints is we're telling it, no, at this point, that's an elbow, and that's where you should bend, right? Like this is how we can define those things. Now, how it deforms this object becomes a little more complicated, right? So basically what it is doing is it is taking every vertex on that model and assigning a joint or multiple joints that can control that vertex, right? So maybe joint 4 is controlling that vertex 0.4 amount, like 40%, right? But another joint 5, is controlling it the other 60%, right? So it's a blend between those. The way we can control that is if we select this object and right click and go to Paint Skin Weights tool. It's going to open up this tool, and you'll notice that my object now has a white and black color to it. And as I choose different joints, you'll see that that white and black color changes. So I have joint 3 selected right now, and what this is showing me is that the white areas are being completely affected by joint 3, and the black areas are being affected none at all, right? So think of white to black or black to white as 0 to 1. Basically, this is just showing me that 0 to 1 percentage. 1 is completely controlled, 0 is not controlled at all. So 0.5 means it's being half controlled by that joint and half controlled by another joint, right? So this is the way that that this works. When I went to paint skin weights tools, that gave me the option to change that. So I can paint my influence right here. I can paint a value of 1. And if I want this section here to be completely controlled by joint 3, I can just paint that value of 1 on there and sort of sharpen that up, right? Painting skin weights is the part of rigging and animation that is sort of equivalent to UV unwrapping to modelers, right? Like, you know, like everybody loves to model, everybody hates to UV unwrap, everybody loves to animate, everybody hates to paint skin weights, right? This is not a super intuitive way of doing this, but it's what we got. So this is kind of the thing we have to fight with. There's some tips and tricks that I can give you to make it a little easier, but that's one of the reasons I said choose a robot that's broken up into individual pieces, because one of those tricks that I'm going to show you here in a bit is much more easily manipulated if the objects are solid individual pieces, right? But if you didn't do that, that's okay. That just means we got a little bit more work in the skin weighting to do. And that's something for you to fight with and get better at. So, okay, I want to show you one more thing about this. I'm just going to go ahead and undo all of this stuff that I've done. See if I can get back to start. As it is right now, this is a perfectly straight line, right? Which means Maya doesn't know which way we would want it to bend. It will allow us to bend it in any direction, but Maya doesn't know which one we would prefer, right? I want to create another skeleton really quick just to show you something. So if I created a skeleton that is sort of, I'll do it from the top up, sort of curved like this, right? Then basically we've told Maya, you should probably assume it's going to bend in this direction, right? And so this is just a little pointer. When you're modeling your character's legs, model it with just a little bit of a bend in the direction that you want it to deform. And that will make this next little section a little easier, because I use my arm as an example for this chain, right? For this FK chain, or for this joint chain, right? And in most of the time, right, my arms are just sort of flopping around out here. Like this is just how I walk down the street, like this, right? And that control is down the hierarchy, right? My shoulder rotates, and that takes my elbow and hand with it, like regardless of what I want, right? And if I want my hand in a different place, I can rotate my elbow, my hand goes with it, right? So it's going forward down the hierarchy. That kind of chain is called an FK chain. So FK stands for forward kinematics. Kinematics really just kind of means motion, right? So it's forward motion. So it's motion that's happening forward down the hierarchy. There's another kind of motion or another kind of control of this chain that we can do, because my arm is not always free-flowing like this, right? Sometimes I grab a hold of things and my arm has to stay in that location, right? And so that means I need the end of my arm to be in control of how my arm bends, right? The place we see this most commonly is our legs, right? Like my legs are stuck to the floor and my hips move around and my feet always stay stuck to the floor. So there's a tool inside of this that will allow us to control our character in that way. It's under skeleton, and it's this create IK handle, right? So IK, sorry, right there. IK is inverse kinematics, so like reverse kinematics, right? The backwards version of kinematics. So I'm just going to go ahead and say create IK handle. I'm going to go to this little options box out here on the end, right? And you'll see that in that options box, I get a couple of options. The biggest two that I need to pay attention to is this rotation plane solver. I want to make sure it says rotation plane, not single chain, right? And so by default, it's set to rotation plane. But the other thing is this sticky right here, right? And so if I click sticky, I want to make sure that that works before we get going. I'm going to click the first joint in this chain and then the last joint in this chain. And it sort of draws a line between the two, right? So when I select the IK like handle is out here at that last point I clicked. And if I grab that, I can now move this around and control that entire chain with that endpoint. The cool thing about this is if I grab this first joint and move it around, that one will stay too. Okay? So this is now working more like my hand would in space. All right, so I'm moving this around, I grab a hold of this, and now my hand is in location, and I can move it around. Yes?
I'm trying to edit something, and orange lines aren't going away. Just trying to, like, I'm pedaling a circle, and then got really upset.
Try going back to object mode and then just going back to
Yeah, orange and all that.
I would save it though, just in case.
I did save it already, but
Try deleting your history. I don't either. I wouldn't sweat it too much. It may be different graphic. That shouldn't really be causing a problem. Yeah, I think it's just a visual thing. I think there's a good chance that you shut down audio and open it back up. Okay. So, FK, IK, that's one of those quiz things. Not that I give quizzes, but someday I will ask you again. What does IK stand for? Anybody remember? Inverse kinematics. Right? Okay, so now we pretty much have all the tools we need to rig this object now, or this robot now. So I'm going to go back to that scene now that we've kind of talked about joints, we've talked about deformers, and we're going to put them into use by going ahead and rigging my robot. Again, you are welcome to kind of follow along, or you can just kind of watch and then implement this into your own later. The first thing I really want to do is I want to be in control of what I'm selecting. And sometimes I'm like, ooh, I want to select this foot. And I select the foot. And I'm like, okay, I want to click out here and like deselect. And I accidentally select the ground and or I accidentally do that. Or like maybe I accidentally like move something I didn't mean to move, right? All of that stuff is frustrating. So I usually do a little bit of organization of my models so I can freeze stuff and so I can turn stuff on and off more easily. So I'm going to grab my ground plane here. I'm going to create a new layer. I'll call that, that's what I wanted to do. I'll call that ground layer. And that way I can turn that on and off when I need to see it or when I don't need to see it. I can also freeze it, right? Click that until it says R. I can also now grab all of this mesh, add it to a layer, and I'll call that layer mesh layer, right? And this is going to be beneficial, one, because I want to be able to turn it on and off just so I can see the skeleton underneath it sometimes. I also want to be able to click this button so I can see through it, and click that so I can freeze it, right? So I just wanted to do a little bit of organization before I get started. And now I don't accidentally select my ground plane, but I can still have it there for reference, right? So the way I usually do this rigging is I pick the angle that is going to allow me to draw this skeleton most cleanly, right? What we don't want to do is create a bunch of skeletal joints and then move them all over the place before we hit skin, right? Just for control reasons, it's usually best if like we create these as close to their final location as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of hide my skirt and belt just so we can see the character a little bit better. And I'm going to go to my side view. I think it's the side view right now. All right, let's do my left view. Yeah, this will work. You can also do it from your right view. Right. I'm going to create my joints at this angle. And the reason for that is because I can automatically create this bend in the knee. Okay. So again, I'm going to go to rigging, right. Skeleton, create joints. Okay. So let's think about all of the different points in which we're needing this thing to rotate. Yes?
When you bent those legs, did you just shift?
Yeah, I just kind of did it when I was modeling it. You could also use the bend deformer to get a little bit of a bend in there, or you can just grab a bunch of vertices and sort of slide them over. It really it kind of depends on what your character's leg looks like. Or if your leg is made up out of different pieces, just kind of rotate them so you just automatically have a little bit of a bend in there. So when we're creating these joints, we're really just thinking about where do we want this object to bend, right? So like if I were rigging my arm, I need to bend at my shoulder, I need to bend at my elbow, I need to bend at my wrist, I need to bend in at least 3 different locations on each finger, right? All of those are pivot points that will need to bend at that location, right? And then the real question is like, well, which one is the first joint, right? And that's kind of a hard one to explain, or a hard one to think around. So I'll just kind of give you the answer. It's going to be where all of the motion starts, right? And for most of us, that is, or most bipedal creatures at least, that's our center of gravity, or root. So it's really kind of around your belt line or your navel, right? Some people maybe a little lower, some people a little higher. It kind of depends on your body mass, right? But think of that, like every motion I move, like everything that I'm doing, all has to sort of start at how my hips shift around, right? I'm pushing against the ground with my feet, and that drives my hips from side to side, right? And that's really how I get my body across the room. If I start walking, what I have to do is sort of throw myself out of balance and start walking with my hips. So this is like our center of gravity, right? So we're going to find that center of gravity point. For my robot, I'm going to assume that's somewhere right around here, right? So I'm going to go, because that's really where I want her to be able to like pivot at the hips, right? If she were going to take a bow, it would be what point is she rotating at for that bow? And like, kind of like that, right? So I want to be able to put it somewhere like that, okay? So that's going to be our root control, R-O-O-T, right? The root of this chain. So the next pivot point is her hip, right? So even though I'm sort of pivoting at that root motion, I also need to be able to raise her leg up and down without rotating her upper body, right? So I'm going to create another joint right here for the hip. And then I'm going to go down to the knee. And then the ankle. And for me, her ankle is right about there because that's the end of sort of that rubber hose looking leg, right? And I don't really want this part to bend quite as much. So go ahead and click right about there for her ankle. So I'm going to keep going down here. The next point at which I would want it to bend would be her toe, or I'm going to call it toe. It's really kind of the ball of the foot, like that part that you would roll up on when you're walking. And so I'm going to put one there for rotation. Yes.
How do you get this inside the leg? Because every time I do it, it wants to like center it.
Mine too. I'll show you in just a second after I'm done. So I'll go ahead and click the ball pointer here. I'm drawing this from the side, recognizing it's probably screwing it up in a different view, basically. So I'm going to click there for the toe. And then this is actually the last object that is really going to rotate. But just so I can see how it's rotating, I'm going to click another one out here on the end And I usually call that toe end. Right? And so when I hit enter now, that's my entire joint chain. But as you said, like if I go and look at this in perspective now, she has this single leg, right, going down the center. Which means like I created this very cleanly, but not everything goes exactly where I want it to, right? So I'm going to just grab that hip joint, and in the x-axis for me, just a single axis, I'm just going to sort of slide this over so it lines up with her leg. Right? Okay. I want to just kind of show you now, I have this entire joint chain over here. If I click this, joint 1, joint 2, joint 3, joint 4, joint 5, joint 6. Which one's joint 4? Bottom part of the knee. So let's look and see. Nope, it's actually the ankle. Because we also have the toe and then the toe end, right? I point that out because this is just one leg, right? And we already are confused about which joint is what. So the exciting part, we're going to name all of it, okay? I will show you something now that this is going to be a really neat trick that makes naming a little less annoying, right? I'm going to just start naming them from over here. So for joint 1, I'll name it root, R-O-O-T, right? But joint 2, that's the hip, right? So I can name it hip, but she obviously has 2, right? I keep using the female pronoun just unnecessarily, but I have another character I named Benbot, so I wanted to make a little female-looking robot as well. So anyway, she has a hip. Which hip is that? Yeah, it's now right now for us it's on the right, right? But I always think of it as like what would this robot call that? They would call it their left hip, right? So so I'm going to name that L underscore hip, right? And I'm naming it that way intentionally, L underscore, okay? Everything on the left side of my character, I'm going to name L underscore that thing. And this is going to save me some time here in a few minutes. So like right here, this will be L underscore knee, right? L underscore ankle. Recognize you can't name anything with a space in here. If you put a space in it, it will just fill it in with an underscore. So L, if I did L space toe, it just puts an underscore in there. And then L space toe end, right? My old email address was Greg underscore Marlowe. And I tried to tell that to someone once, like verbally, and they wrote Greg under squirrel Marlowe. And I was like, I really wish that was my email address. So, under squirrel. Okay, so we have all of these underscores. In fact, we can quickly recognize the entire left side of our character just because all of it starts with L underscore, right? So here's where this gets really cool. If we created this character on our origin line, right? Like if we go look at our grid and we see that like she's perfectly centered on that x-axis, right? I can now mirror this leg across to the other side. Now I can do it sort of the manual way, which is just hit Control D and slide that over, and that works. But I'm going to show you a trick that makes this way easier, right? Which is if I select the hip, not the root, but the hip, okay? And I go to Skeleton, Mirror Joints, I'm going to go to my options box. We get a couple of interesting options here, right? First it asks which axis do I want to mirror across, Okay, so if I am in my perspective view, you'll notice that down here in the bottom, I'm wanting it to go in my x-axis. So I basically just choose the one that doesn't have x in it, right? So YZ. I want it to mirror across that YZ plane, right? But here's why we named this the way we did. So replacement names for duplicate joints. If I don't change anything here, it will basically just put a 1 at the end of hip. It'll be L hip 1. Like it's like going to start numbering them, right? But if instead I go for search for L underscore and replace that with R underscore, right, and I hit mirror, I get a perfect set of legs over on this side that are all named correctly, okay? And it's going to be in the exact right location too. So again, that's mirror joints, and then I just tell it to find and replace that L underscore with R underscore, okay? We're pretty much done. Yeah, I wrote that myself. I didn't know. So rigging is one of those things where it's very easy to get messy quickly, right? We're going to start making things are going to start breaking. And so you kind of have to save often and recognize that probably on average, I would say 2/3 of my class ends up having to create this rig twice, right? Like you'll get halfway through it, something will mess up. They'll be like, why is it messed up? And my answer is usually like, the easiest answer is really just to go back and redo it, right? So don't sweat that. It maybe even is worth trying a rough version of the rig, recognizing you're going to mess some stuff up, and then go back and get a cleaner rig. And so I'm trying to show you like really slowly and very precisely in a way to keep it as clean as possible. So what you can test this now. We can see how it works. Like you'll see that if I grab my root and move it around, the legs go with it, right? What we got to do though is always remember to Control Z to get it back to this clean state. Because what somebody will eventually do is they'll grab this and move it over here, and then they'll go on about their business. And then when it comes time to skin it, now that knee is in the wrong point, right? So just remember to always kind of try to get it back to here, or save here so you can come back to this point if something messes up, right? Now, this is not controlling our character yet. I'm going to show you that we can just go ahead and skin it now if we wanted to. And it's going to try its best. Like I feel like, yeah, bless its heart, it's going to try. But it's like, it's going to fail, right? It's going to give me a bad result about this. So if I just select everything except the floor, right? Select the root of that and hit skin, bind skin. So now this is controlling my robot. And if I start rotating this, you'll see it's trying, but like it's really going to mess a bunch of stuff up, right?
Oh, she's beautiful.
Well, yeah, she is.
What happened to her skirt?
I hid it just so I could see where I was placing the joint. So
Okay.
yeah, they're in there. I just have them
I
like
thought
temporarily.
you just were like, no, she's naked now.
Yeah. No, actually what I'm going to do in the long run is I actually end up not skinning the skirt and simulating that with Maya Koff. So like that, I may not get to do that in class, but we all kind of played around with Maya Koff a little bit, and I can show you some tricks on how to do that. So actually, I think somebody was even mentioning like cakes and stuff like that. You can do that. Recognize it's a little extra work, and you have to do some simulation, and so like it's that. But that's cool. If it's something you're wanting to push yourself on, I guarantee you will grow in good ways because of that, right? So so the other hard part about this is if I wanted to make her sort of like squat down, like she's gonna jump or something, if I move my root control right now, her feet just go to the floor. And it's really hard to counter animate this to get her feet back up there and in the right spot, right? So I mean that may be close, but it's just a lot of like tedious work, and I can't do that for every frame of the animation. So that's why IK is so useful, right? If I go now, skeleton, create IK handle, I'm going to make sure that sticky is turned on, rotation plane solver. I'll click the hip and then the ankle, right, on this, and I'll actually hit G to do that again. Hip, and the ankle. Now if I grab her hips and move her down, her ankles stay stuck. It's still not perfect, but it's closer, right? So this is where I'm at right now. Again, the point of rigging is to create something that an animator can manipulate and get a good animation from, right? Animation is really hard. Rigging is hard. Modeling is hard. It's all hard, right? But really, the whole point of rigging is to make an animator's life a little easier so they can work on getting a better performance, right? You don't want them fighting the tool, right? And so the thing I usually ask myself when creating a rig is, what is it I need it to do when I start animating, right? And just like everything else we've done so far, I'm going to create some controls, like just some circles in here, right, that allow me to make those things happen on the rig, right? So a couple of things I want to be able to control the hips with a control, right? I want to be able to control each of the legs. I want the feet to stay flat on the ground at all times, even if I move the hips down. I want the feet to still sort of stay in the right orientation. And right now they're kind of swimming all over the place when I push her hips down. And I want to have at least a control for her toe, so I can wiggle her toe around a little bit, and so I can sort of aim her knee, right? So you'll notice that when I squat her down, her knees are pointing straight forward, right? But if I wanted to make her look shy and like point her knees inward, like that's all being controlled by that IK, right? And so I'll show you how we're going to implement all of those things. Before I jump into that, I just want to kind of slow down. I feel like for the most part, people are kind of watching along. I don't know if people are really following along. Does anybody have any questions so far? Is this making sense?
I have so many questions.
So many?
I feel like it's personal to my robot.
Okay,
Like, I modeled it with already a bend in the knee.
good.
Do I need to unmodel that, or am I able to do the joints with a bend?
No, you should have the bend in the knee. So like, well, I mean, it depends on how bent the knee is. Like,
I mean, it's not like a 90-degree angle. It's just like a normal.
yeah. So there's actually a good question that you're asking there, or you're asking it in a different way. But really, like, how do you model your character, and in what pose should you model your character? Yes. That is a good one. I guess I should have addressed that maybe a little earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Greg.
Yeah, I suck at this. Well, because I mean, everybody's kind of doing something different, right? My general rule of thumb is you model your character in a relatively relaxed but average pose, right? Like, I'm not going to model like a full human, like standing in the Captain Morgan pose or anything like that, right? Like, because everything's asymmetrical, and how often do I really hit this pose, right? I want to get something sort of neutral to every pose. Humans, usually when we model a human, I'm trying to see if I'm actually on the screen so you can see this in the video. Humans, generally, you do either the A pose or the T pose, which is your feet, for the most part, with your toes pointing kind of forward, evenly spaced, right? And then if your character has arms, they're either in a T pose. That's why when you're playing a video game and something messes up and they're like running around like this, or the A pose, which is a slightly more relaxed version of the T pose. It's like your hands kind of down and a little bit more relaxed. This is way advanced in this. I personally like the A pose. I feel like it's a lot easier to take it from that A pose into most reasonable poses without stretching the skin too much. But that's a model or animator debate. And but just recognize that you're going to find your version of your character's sort of neutral pose, right? So if your character has like some bend in the knee, that's cool. You maybe don't want to model your character squatting, right? Like a rabbit or something like that, right? I usually think like, what is the pose they're going to be in the most, and what is the sort of the most extreme pose they're going to have to get into. So maybe with a rabbit, I wouldn't model them all like scrunched up. I would sort of stretch out their legs a little bit. That way I could sort of scrunch them in underneath them, or I could push them out, and I get a little bit of both, right? So it's a little bit of a hard thing to consider, but everybody's robot's a little bit different. If you have some questions about that, I can sort of analyze it for you and help you determine sort of if you need to change the pose a little bit in the model. But more than likely, most of you, I've never seen anybody in this class have a huge problem with it, so you're probably okay. So something else that a lot of people recognize is that not all creatures have the same leg configuration that we do, right? So for example, I'm going to just sort of doodle on my screen here. There's this tool called the grease pencil that'll allow you to just draw in here. A horse, if you look at a horse's leg, you have this hip, you have this knee, and then you have this like part that points backwards, and then the hoof, right? And so they kind of have this like this thing going on, right? And then they got this, this big haunch here, like something kind of like this. It's really hard to draw with a mouse, right? So like a horse leg, a goat leg, it kind of has that configuration, right? So strangely, we do too. It's just a different sort of scale of each of those joints, right? So if this horse, if its ankle were to, or this backwards pointing knee here, right, were to flatten out onto the ground, right, we kind of have the same thing that a human leg has, right? A human leg is hip, knee, right, ankle, toe, right? So it's the same thing, it's just sort of a different stretch of it. And so this will all work no matter what your character's leg is like. Even if you have like a curvy like rubber hose arm, like or leg or something like that, that's fine too. So think of like the anatomy that's underneath that, like what it is that makes it work that way. And we can rig all of those things. So just sort of design for design's sake, like do your design of what looks cool, and then we'll figure out how to make it move, right? So I'm going to go ahead and delete that out of there. All right, so we have our character here ready to move. Oh, I guess any other questions right now? At this point, okay. So the three things I'm going to create. I'm going to create a hip controller, and I'm going to create a controller for each of the feet, right? Actually, today in class, I'm probably just going to do one of the feet because they're both the same. And strangely, for the most part, you already know all of the tools we're going to use for this, for the most part, right? The only thing we're really going to implement that's any different is a constraint. And a constraint is a way of one object controlling another object without having to change the hierarchy. So it's like making a parent of an object without having to like parent it underneath it, right? So I'm going to go ahead and make my controls, right? So NURBS circle here. And I'm going to go ahead and scale this up. And I'm going to go ahead and move this and snap it to my root joint up here. Now, there's a couple of different ways I can do that. I'm going to show you both of them here. If I hide my mesh, if I just hold down V and move this, it will start snapping to different points, right? It will also snap to like grid points on my plane and stuff like that, but it will snap to that top joint as long as I'm holding down V. So V is a point snap, right? X is your grid snap. and C is curve snap. So if I had a curve, I need to snap it to. I'll show you another way we could do that. Under modify, match transformations. And this one's actually really kind of neat. I'm just going to match the translations. So I have to select the curve first, I think, and then the joint. And I do match translation. And it'll just move it up there to that location. Okay. So either of those methods will work. You can also do match rotation, but currently that root joint is kind of in a weird angle. So now I have this circle control on there for that. Yes?
Do you ever freeze transformations on all of your...
I do, because after now I've moved that, if you look over here, all of that is messed up now, right? So one of the things we do is I will freeze my transformations at this point, or at some point before I go much further, right? So not only do I have some scale information on there, I have some translate information. So if I go to modify, freeze transformations, it zeroes all of that back out, right? Now the reason for that is because we're going to rig this character in this pose, and then you're going to animate your character running around, and you're going to, you're going to have fun with that. And then you're going to be like, you know what? I'm going to animate my character doing something else now. I want to get it back to that pose I started in, that neutral pose I rigged the character in, right? Well, if I've frozen all my transformations, all I have to do now is select those three controls and type 0 in my translates and rotates, and it will just take it back to that default pose, right? So it's called freezing out your, zeroing out your transformations, right? And so most rigs, we want to do that just so it's cleaner. If you forget to do that, you can still work with it, but you're going to have a hard time getting back to that bind pose again. So, again, just in the name of sort of cleanliness, I want to name this. So now it's NURB Circle 1. I'm going to call it HIP CTRL. I do that for control, like an abbreviation for control. And there we go. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that circle. What's my shortcut key for duplicate? Control D. I would encourage you to use Control D, not Control C, Control V. That's a slightly different thing, and we get a much uglier name if we do that. So if I hit Control D, I get hip Control 1. If I did Control C, Control V, I get this weird group pasted hip Control 1, right? That's just not the best way of doing it. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. I'll go ahead and call this L foot control. L underscore foot control. Bless you. So again, holding down V, I'll go ahead and snap that to my ankle. I'll go ahead and scale this to make it something a little more reasonable, right? And modify freeze transformations. Again, I can duplicate this, Control D, W, snap that using V. I'll go ahead and change my name, R foot control 1, right? And so that's all of the controls I need. The reason I'm doing this is because eventually what I want to do is hide all of those joints and all of that IK. So the only three things I need to animate are those three curves, right? And I should be able to get all the animation I need out of those three curves, or out of those three controls, right? Okay. The next stage I'm going to do is sort of setting up, having these controls control those objects, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and hide my floor. That thing's just kind of getting in my way. Yeah, see that better? I will be here on Friday. I actually have a couple of meetings I have to go to during this class time, so it'll probably be best to try to catch me before class if you can. But yeah, I'll be around, and I'll try to post this video here in just a little bit. So, okay. So having these controls control this rig or control these hips, we've learned a couple of techniques for this. I'm going to show you a new one. I'm going to kind of go off. Actually, I'll just open up a new version, this other version of Maya, just to kind of show you how this works. Right. Right now, if I made a couple of spheres, right, Control D, right? And I'll just go ahead and delete all these other things. So I have these three spheres here, right? And if I wanted this sphere to control the location of this sphere, one of the easy things I can do is just parent sphere 2 under sphere 1, right? Middle click, drag that on top of it. And now when I move sphere 1, sphere 2 goes with it, right? And when I rotate sphere 1, sphere 2 will rotate it around it, right? But sometimes I want to be able to get that same effect without actually having to change the hierarchy of the object, right? So that's what I'm going to use a constraint for, right? So if we look up here in our rigging menu, right, there's this constraint. So let's open this up and let you look at some of them. There are, let's just look at these top three. There's parent, point, and orient. And of course, there's all these others down here too. We'll not worry about those so much right now. So let's look at parent first. What happens with parent? So if I select sphere 1, hold shift, select sphere 2, and I click parent constraint, you'll see that it doesn't parent anything underneath it. But what it does do is it puts something else underneath P sphere 2, right? That's this constraint. And even though they're separated in the hierarchy, it's still going to act as if they're not, right? It's going to act as if I just parented them, okay? And if I rotate, we get it rotating around it, right? Now, I'm going to go ahead and delete that constraint, and I'm going to do it a little differently here. If I hold down shift and I do a point constraint, let's watch what happens. It looks like P sphere 2 disappeared. It didn't. It's in the exact same location as P sphere 1, right? It's basically taking all of the values from my translates right here and driving the translates of P sphere 2, okay? Which means wherever I move P sphere 1, P sphere 2 is going to go with it, okay? So a point constraint is a translate constraint. Right? Now I can make a translate constraint work without it shifting that object back to the same location. So if I undo all that stuff I just did, there we go. Select them both again, go to point and go to my options. I can click this maintain offset and it will keep that distance between them now. And so when I hit add, now that's still over there, but everywhere I move this, it will go with it. Now if I rotate it, it doesn't rotate though, because it's just controlling the translates of this object. The order in which you select these is very important, okay? So I'm going to undo that and get that out of the way. So what you want to select is the parent first, and then hold shift and select the child, the thing that is going to be controlled, right? So if I do orient constraint, watch what happens here. This one's interesting. If I hit orient constraint, you would think that that means that when I rotate this object, this would go around it, right? But it doesn't, right? But you will notice that that middle object is doing something, right? In fact, if we hit 4, you can kind of see that it's doing the same rotation. Okay? So really what's happening is the rotation channels on my parent object are controlling the rotation channels on my second object. That's why they're blue, right? So that's how these constraints work, right? So I wanted to show you those because we're going to use these constraints to drive these different joints, right? So I'm going to select my control. Like sometimes this arrow gets in your way. If you hit Q, it will go away. So this is like select, not move. So I can hold shift and select my root joint, right? And I'm just going to do which constraint? Which constraint do you think I need to do? Parent, orient, or point?
Parent.
Parent. Why parent?
Because the first, it's your hips, it's the top one, so you want everything else to parent underneath it.
Yeah, but what we're doing right now is having that joint at the top be controlled by the curve, right? So a parent constraint controls which values? Or which channels? That's not real. Is that real? Bulls Gap, Tennessee. Oh, don't leave me a message. So a parent constraint controls both your translates and your rotates. Okay? So there are times where I'm going to want to rotate that character's hips, and there's times I'm going to want to move them. Right? So that's why I'm going to use a parent constraint. So parent. And so now what you'll see is just by moving this control, I can control my character's hips. Okay. And again, like I was saying earlier, like if we get our character way down here and we're doing something else and forget and go, oh no, if I froze my transformations, that means I can just type 0 right here and it will go back to its default pose, right? Okay. Now this is where it gets a little complicated. As it is right now, if I move my IK handle, my character's leg moves up, right? But notice that its toe points down, right? So basically what's happening is this joint is moving and this joint is rotating, right? But this joint is not, right? It's still sort of staying in the same orientation. And so as this joint here rotates, that toe points down, right? I don't want that. I want the foot to always stay in the orientation of that controller. So this is an important distinction. I'm going to do 2 different constraints in this foot. I'm going to do a point constraint on the IK handle. So whenever I move the control, it's going to move the IK handle. But I'm going to do an orient constraint with an offset on the foot bone, on the foot joint, right? So let me show you really quickly. Control, select that IK handle, constrain point. And so now when I move this control, that foot's going to move with it, right? But the toe is still pointing down. So if I select the foot control and that joint, not the IK, but the ankle joint, right? If I do constraint orient, the foot's going to flip around, right? So I don't really want that, right? What I'm going to do is constrain orient, go to my options box, and choose maintain offset. Okay. If I hit add to that, then now when I move this control, that foot is going to stay in the same orientation as my control, right? The toe doesn't point down anymore. The reason that's beneficial is I still haven't done that to this one over here. Watch what happens. What's the difference between the 2 feet? So that one feels like it's locked to the floor now, right? And if I turn on my character's mesh, that feels much more realistic, right? Now, again, I know there's still some skinning issues. We'll talk about those here in just a minute here. Again, just to show you that whole process again, select the foot control and then the IK handle. And I'm going to use which constraint? Point, right? Just for the IK handle. And then the control and this joint. And I'll use the orient constraint, but I want to make sure maintain offset is turned on, right? And so now this should, for the most part, work, right? Now, this is close. Like for some of you, if your character doesn't have a toe, you may be ready to almost start animating, right? There's a couple of things that are missing. I want to add a toe joint. I want to add a knee aim, right? And we actually already know the tools for that. I'm just going to create a new channel, and I'm going to use the connection editor to connect them to those different things, right? The other thing I want to do, though, is I want to make the skinning work better. So what you'll notice is if I grab this control and start pulling this foot over, 1, her head for some reason starts getting really small, and 2, these feet do this really weird stuff here, right? All of that is because of the skinning, right? The way we skinned it. So that means we're going to have to paint some skin weights, okay? And that's a little messy, but I'm going to show you, at least for this one, that for most of this character, it's actually pretty simple, right? Because I have divided this up in a way that each joint will control a specific object, right? So, so let's go ahead and add the toe first, and then we'll do the skinning. And actually, we're getting kind of close on time here, so this next little section may go a touch faster, just to show you. But you can kind of watch the video on like 0.75 speed if you need to. So again, zero this foot back out. All right. So what I want is I want an extra control on my foot control that controls the toe, controls this joint's rotation. And if you notice, it's its Z rotation. I want to be able to wiggle the toe around. And I want to be able to control the angle the knee is pointing. Now that's a little more complicated, right? If I actually select this IK, the way I control that is this button right here, this twist value. This is one of the reasons we do rotation plane instead of single chain IK. And so now you can see I can kind of point the knee a little bit with that, right? So those are the two things I want to control on. So I'm going to select this control, and we're going to add a new attribute. You all remember how to do that? Anybody?
Window, general editor.
I think that's the next step, but you're close. So we got to add the attribute first. Yes, modify. So modify, add attribute. Okay. So I'm going to add two attributes. It's going to be toe and knee. Okay. So TOE for the toe. Add. KNEE. Knee. Add. Okay. And so now that control has a toe and a knee control on there, right? So you were right on this next part though. This is the connection editor. So if I go to Windows, General Editors, Connection Editor, we get this. Right now it's empty. So it's whatever is going to be doing the driving is on the left. It's going to be controlling what's ever on the other side. So if I grab this control, say reload left, it's going to load my control in here. You'll see down at the bottom, toe and knee. This is how we were also doing the squash and stretch control. Remember that? So what do I need the toe to control?
What do you plan on doing with the toe?
I want the toe to rotate up and down like this. So what does that channel on this thing need to control?
Rotate Z.
Needs to control the rotate Z of that joint, right? Because you notice when we rotate it, that's where that value comes in, right? So I'm going to select that joint and hit reload right. And so you'll see there's my rotate Z. So I click toe, I click rotate Z. And so now this channel, when I adjust the toe, the character's toe wiggles around, right? So the knee needs to control that twist on the IK. So what I can do is I can select the IK handle and hit reload right. And what we're looking for is this twist right here. So knee, twist. Right? And so now, if I close this, that's going to control my toe. That's going to control my knee point. And we pretty much have a whole functional leg. To go through that again very quickly, select the control, modify, add attribute, toe, add, knee, add, and then Windows, General Editor, Connection Editor. The driver is the controller, so reload left, right? On there, toe and knee. So the toe is going to control the rotate Z of this channel, right? So I'm going to grab that that joint, reload right, toe, rotate Z, right? And then the knee is going to control the twist on this IK channel or IK handle. So reload right, knee, and twist. So I actually now have a fully functional rig, right? So much so that all I really need to be able to see is the character's mesh, right? And these three controls. So I'm going to hide everything else. I'm going to select all these things right here. I'm going to put them in their own layer. I'll call it rigging. Hit save. And just hide that, right? Because I can now grab these and select the things that I need to control. However, again, our mesh still does not deform exactly the way we want it to. So this is where it gets a little bit frustrating. We have to start painting some skin weights. And for some areas, it's going to be harder than others, right? So, for example, if I move my character's leg up like this, right, you see how this area starts to collapse there? So for some of this, I need to be able to go in there, select this mesh, right-click, paint skin weights tools. I need to choose the knee, and I need to go in here and say, no, I need this to have more knee weight, right? So again, my value is set to 1. If I hold down B, I can sort of scale my brush size. We can also do that, I think, where's that at? There's a brush size option in here, I think. It's right down here, I think. Yeah, so it's this radius U there. But if you just hold down B, you can kind of scale it that way too. My value is set to 1, and so I'm just going to paint more influence on the back of the knee here, and now it'll kind of retain that shape, right? In painting skin weights, if I need it to, if I need to soften that, if I hold down Shift, it will kind of smooth that area a little bit. And so I can add some weight to it and then smooth it out a little bit if it's too much, right? Same with the, if I go up here to the left hip, I need to add a little bit more back here because it's losing volume, right? And so I may do something like that, and I'm getting a little bit of a better result. But that's going to be very frustrating when I'm trying to paint all of these vertices here that are stretching, right? Now, one of the reasons that it is beneficial to keep all of these as a single object or as single objects is because there's another paint skin weights tool that makes this a little easier. If I right click on here, go to paint skin weights tool, as long as my value is set to 1, I choose the object I want to control it, which is this left ankle, right? And I just flood that entire weight, or flood that entire object with 1, with a value of 1, right? And so now it's fixed. So I just had to do that one thing, and it completely fixes that skinning. So I can do that with the toe again. Paint skin weights. Flood the entire thing to the toe. Right? And so for all of those rigid pieces, I can just go through and flood them like that, right? So let's go here and look at some of these more complicated ones. The body, paint skin weights. I want the root to be what's controlling that. So right now, other parts are kind of deforming it a little bit. Root, and then I just hit flood. Her eyes disappeared, so let's go find those objects. So both of the eyes and the bow, I want those to be controlled by the head too. So I'll right click on here and say paint mode, right? Flood, right? So I'm flooding that value of 1 to them. And so now all of that stuff is pretty clean in the way it moves there, right? I still need to work on some of this over here, maybe even this thing here. Just kind of recall. Paint skin weights. I'm going to flood that to the right ankle. And then this thing, paint skin weights. Flood that to the right toe. So now my character is pretty much done. The skirt and the belt, let me go ahead and turn those back on. For right now, I'm going to go ahead and skin those. Like they're already skinned. I'll go ahead and flood those to the root as well. More than likely what will happen is I will unskin the skirt and I will simulate that with a fabric simulation. So this is ready to animate. So I just select that control, zero it back out, and we're ready to go. Just gonna dance. Doo -doo. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time to be working on this. Like we have Friday's class to be working on it. I'm going to save this video, upload it to YouTube so you can be watching that. When we come back on Monday, we're going to be animating this. Right? I'm going to do a walk cycle with this character. Does that feel like that gives you enough time to kind of implement this rig, or would you rather push that to Wednesday? If we push it to Wednesday, you have less time to animate. I personally would, let's see where we're at on Monday. I personally would prefer to do it on Monday so you have a little bit more time to fight with the animation and the rendering. So yeah, we're going to aim for Monday. Basically, I'm going to animate this character doing a walk cycle, and then we're done. Like that's, from there, you just have to finish that up, render it out. So any questions, comments on any of this while I'm still recording? All right, cool. I will go ahead and save this out and upload the video so you'll have this to kind of walk through. Again, please, please, please submit revisions. The grades are up there. Check them out. See what it is that you need to focus on. If you're needing to talk with me, if you need to sit down and like help me work, or have me help you work through some stuff to get like some of the bugs out of something. If you're having issues, don't hesitate to grab me. Friday is the next class period, but I have a couple of projects that, well, so some of the graduating seniors have what is called a thesis presentation, and so I'm their thesis advisor, so I need to go to that. I will be in my office pretty much from 8 a.m. till about 3 p.m., but at about 3 p.m. I have to go to those presentations. So I'll still be in the building, but it would probably be best to try to grab me before this class period. Also, again, David Hamilton and Brianna Edmonds, they are both in here during the tutoring sessions. So grab them; they can help you as well. So, all right, rest of the class is yours.